Well, as everybody knows, tonight is going to be how to manage your meadows from the true professionals of meadow management at Herefordshire Meadows. So we're going to hear a lot more about Herefordshire Meadows, meadows in general, and I think we're always going to talk a bit about how we can manage our meadows, some of the theory behind that in preparation for the 2 in-person events we've got with Herefordshire Meadows later in the summer. So I'm looking forward to this, and I shall be taking notes to learn a lot, I'm sure. So I'll hand over to Rory.
Okay, great. Thank you, Louise. So yes, for those who don't know who I am, my name is Rory Johnson, and I'm a Meadows advisor with Herefordshire Meadows. And for those who don't know what Herefordshire Meadows is, haven't come across us before, so we are a registered charity. We have been since 2022, and we formed out of originally being a farmer cluster discussion group. And we work all across Herefordshire championing species-rich grasslands, conserving, restoring and creating them, but also doing lots of other things alongside that. So one-to-one advisory support and signposting to project funding, partnership working, education, advocacy, working with schools and a volunteer programme. So we have a very varied portfolio. So this evening, I'm going to cover quite a lot of ground, and hopefully I can pack it all into an hour. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour introduction to meadows and meadow management, and also meadow creation work. And I thought I also would tag in a few slides on also how you can help, and some of the things that we can all each individually be doing to be supporting our fantastic species-rich grasslands. So without further ado, I will talk about origins of meadows. There's sometimes a slight misconception that meadows are an anthropogenic habitat. This stems more likely than not because of the fact that they are a managed environment. They are managed within our agricultural system, but actually, the meadow plants that we know well, a lot of these have been around for a lot longer than agriculture in this country. And there are pollen records showing that these plants we now associate with meadows were present as far back as the interglacial period. And there is a well-known Dutch ecologist, a guy called Frans Vera, who some of you may have heard of before, who proposed a counter argument to the traditional closed canopy theory, the fact that after the glacial period it was just one vast woodland forest that would be stretching across the British Isles, and he postulated on the role of large herbivores creating much more mosaic systems, more of a wood pasture and open glades environment with regular periods of disturbance. And the existence of a lot of our meadow plants go quite a long way to supporting this, because they would have originally been these open woodland glades specialists. That's where they would have developed originally. And then obviously they have been facilitated through man's manipulation of our environment, through more woodland clearance with the arrival of agriculture. These species were favoured by that, and that is they have then become part of this managed grassland system that then persisted for thousands of years in this country. It's interesting that the roots, the etymology of the word meadow is very intricately linked to the word for to cut and to mow. And this gives an indication, again, as I say, of this being very much a managed habitat. So the Old English word is meath. I don't know how good my Old English is, but it means a grassland that is cut. And from that, we have derived the word meadow. And whilst this is a Germanic word, actually, we have evidence that these cut grassland systems were in existence far further back in the past than the sort of Anglo-Saxon period. So there is widespread belief that as far back as the Iron Age, possibly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, this would have been part of a system which basically is providing winter forage for livestock, domesticated livestock. And there have been evidence in Roman archaeological digs. They have actually found scythes. So we know with certainty that scything was occurring during the Roman period. The true definition of a meadow would be one that is an area of grassland that is cut and grazed. But I will interchangeably use the word meadow and species-rich grassland and flower-rich grassland. And species-rich grassland encompasses a much broader category. So that will also include species-rich permanent pastures and species-rich rush pastures. So that's kind of a broader category that encompasses a wider variety of different grassland types. So meadow management, in a nutshell. This is a lovely poster, which was it's actually the Marches Meadows group developed this as part of the People's Postcode Lottery Fund. Lovely illustrated poster showing the annual wheel calendar and the broad management regime over a calendar year. So very broadly, meadow management would have involved what we call shutting up the field in early March. So that is removing all grazing livestock and then allowing the vegetation to grow up during the spring and early summer period before then taking a hay cut, typically in July. The haymaking happens after the flowers and grasses, many of them have gone to seed, as opposed to a silage system, which tends to cut earlier. And this creates that natural cycling of the broadleaf herbs, the regeneration of the seed into the system. And then following that hay cut, there would be a period of what's called aftermath grazing through the autumn and the winter. And that is grazing off the grass regrowth. So without this management, species diversity would gradually decline as more dominant grasses would then take hold, and eventually, if there was no intervention at all, that would steadily progress towards more scrub and trees and moving away from open habitat to a woodland. The aftermath grazing there's kind of no hard and fast rule in this, but broadly the aim is to have short grass by the following spring. That is to keep the sward, so the surface of the field open. And again, that is favouring diversity because it is reducing the vigour of more fuggish, particularly grasses, it is giving space for that recycling and regeneration of the species. So as I say, this is a very kind of broad overview of that management, how it would typically pan out, but it's good to be clear that the management needs to be adapted to specific circumstances of each location and situation and even season. So, for example, now it's a very exciting time of year because our first yellow rattle seedlings are appearing. So there's a little photo of some seedlings there, sometimes called the meadow maker. It's particularly useful as a tool when moving from a grass-dominated system to trying to have something more botanically diverse. It's hemiparasitic on grass, so it will reduce the vigor of the grasses and give space to the other species. But it's also and it's an annual plant. So it's at high risk of being grazed off and not being able to go through its full life cycle, which it needs to do every year on year. So we're starting to see the seedlings appearing, and that is a sign to be shutting up the field and removing grazing livestock. But that can vary, year on year. The weather, the spring temperatures will vary widely, and even the topography and the aspect of a site can have mean that it has weeks in the span of the yellow rattle germination. So we had our first sightings came through on nice low-lying south-facing slopes at the end of February, actually, so the very end of February, but there's some sites which are north-facing and much higher in the kind of edge of the uplands in the county, which still won't have had any germination yet. So this is what I mean about being aware of the specific nuances of any particular site. And the same goes also with grazing. So there is, on this poster here, there are sheep shown, but you can also be grazing with other herbivores, so cattle, goats, horses, but you need to then adapt that grazing to be aware of the different sizes of the animals, so the impact they might have in terms of in wet conditions, for example, potentially causing more soil disturbance with larger animals, and the grazing styles. So in a extensive species-rich pasture scenario, for example, cattle are far preferable because they are much less selective grazers, and you could have more flexibility and tolerance about the grazing window with them as a result, whereas sheep tend to be much more selective, and so really they do need to be coming off when those seedlings are emerging, because they are also very tasty for the sheep. Again, soil conditions as well. That's obviously going to be another variable which is going to have an influence as well on the kind of the rate of the growth. And there's lots of different types of species-rich grasslands. So this is Natural England's very broad categorization. I've highlighted here lowland meadows, and specifically species-rich lowland meadows, as opposed to floodplain meadows, which also fall under that Natural England category. And that is because the majority of meadows within Herefordshire do fall under this type. That's not to say that the others are not present. And we do have examples of old floodplain meadows, the best one being the Lug Meadows, or the old Lammas Meadows just to the east of Hereford. But we are quite limited on these other meadow types, and that's mainly a reflection of the homogeneity of the geological makeup of the county. So the vast majority of the county is relatively low lying, and it's on the old red sandstone, which has neutral to slightly acidic soil types. There are patches of calcareous bedrock around the county, so most notably in the Woolhope Dome, up and around Wigmore, and there's some small patches just to the west of the Malvern Hills as well. But broadly, as I say, lowland meadows are the main grassland habitat type that we will be seeing within the county. And they're very rare, so I will touch upon this more in a few slides' time. But we're looking at a situation where there's estimated to be only 6,000 hectares left in the whole of England, which is a tiny fraction of the land area. And even the ones that remain, they are very fragmented, and they are often very small. So almost 10% of them are less than 5 hectares in size. But they are fantastically species rich, and this is where their value comes from. They can have 15 to up to 40. I personally have not found one yet which has 40 different species in a single metre squared, but there are meadows that are that species rich. This picture here is a picture of looking down over our county Coronation Meadow, which is Jones Hill Reserve, which is a plant life reserve in the Woolhope Dome. And it is, if you haven't been already, I strongly encourage you to visit in late June. It is an absolutely phenomenal site, particularly for, as you can see here, the orchid display of common spotted orchids. But it's not just about orchids. So there is a whole list of, again, this is Natural England's definition, what they call indicator species. So if you have some of these present, then that is an indication that you are looking at a lowland meadow. And this is just an abbreviated list. The full list that actually runs to almost 50 different species. And there are resources on their websites, on the Natural England website. You can search for the full indicator list, and I can, if we're sending follow-up notes, I can also share some of these resources after this. And then there's depending on the presence and abundance of these indicators, that is a reflection of the quality of your lowland meadow. So there is a categorization called the priority habitat inventory, which again is managed by Natural England, and they have a threshold which is to have 2 indicator species occurring frequently and 2 occurring occasionally across your site to meet that priority habitat threshold status. So when we say frequently, that would be in 50% of stops. So if you were to do quadrat surveying, if you were to do 10 or 20, however many quadrats, 1 meter squared quadrat stops, if the indicator species was present in 50% of those, that would be frequent, and in 30 to 40% that would be occasional, and you need a minimum of two frequent, 2 occasional. You also will be looking for very low, so less than 5% cover populations of ryegrass and white clover, and also creeping buttercup. This because these species are indications of agricultural improvement, and not typical species of semi-natural grasslands. So, as I say, I've sort of touched upon the rarity of these habitats. This is the kind of the heavy bit of the talk, and why we are championing species-rich grasslands, because we have seen a staggering loss in a relatively short period of time of these habitats. So this was a piece of work that was commissioned by Plant Life. They did a whole nation grassland, species-rich grassland inventory, and found that over 97% of our wildflower meadows have been lost since the 1930s. So to put that into kind of acreage areas again, the estimation is that pre-Second World War, there was about 7.5 million acres of species-rich grassland, and that's now dropped to 26,000 acres, and 15,000 of which of lowland meadow, and then the other 11,000 are these other species-rich grassland types that I mentioned earlier. And the loss accelerated, began in the 1940s. The majority of the reason is due to land use changes, so changes in farming practices and approaches, and that loss simply accelerated through in the 1970s and 1980s. And whilst it now has plateaued at this very small remnant population that we have left, there is still, unfortunately, a steady ongoing decline happening. So the Herefordshire context, and this I have to give reference here to a absolutely fantastic ecologist who is based quite locally to us, a gentleman called George Peterkin, who was originally woodland ecologist, but now has done a lot of work looking at wood meadows and meadow systems as well, and was part of the parish grasslands group. So he did an analysis of the Herefordshire's situation in terms of grassland loss. And as you can see here, that is showing, it's quite faint, I apologise, but that is showing from 1940 the steep decline in the area of species-rich grasslands within the county down to the late 1980s. And then, as I say, it sort of plateaus off, but is still in steady decline. But I think what's also really interesting in the research that he did was to show that prior to that period, actually there was quite a lot of fluctuation in terms of the amount of species-rich grasslands. And this was linked to periods of sort of boom and bust within agriculture in general, and sort of commodity prices of arable versus pastoral systems. So the perception of our meadows being ancient is in quite a lot of cases with our lowland meadows is a bit of a misnomer. So in the in 1940, for example, you can see here that actually at least 40% of the meadows that were around in 1940 were less than 80 years old. So it would have been as part of that management system, it would have been part of that cycling and moving of species-rich grasslands sort of around the farm, around the mixed farm system. But some of our species-rich grasslands are truly ancient as semi-natural ancient woodlands, particularly our floodplain meadows, of which we have very few left, species-rich floodplain meadows. The old maps, I've mentioned the one in Herefordshire, the Lug Meadows, but the old maps show that as continuous use as floodplain meadows right the way back to sort of medieval times, and famously was linked with the building of Hereford Cathedral, the hay sales off that site. And sites like Jones Hill Meadow also is, as far as we can see from historical records, that has also been managed as species-rich grassland for a very long period of time. So that just gives a bit of a context and background to what meadows are, what the position currently is in terms of the threats that they are under. But next, I'm going to just move on to why that matters. Why should we be worrying so much about such staggering losses in this habitat? And there's a lot packed into this lovely little wheel diagram, which again Plant Life have put together. I'm going to go into some of these into a bit more detail, but the overarching message is that species-rich grassland deliver a whole range of what we now call terms sometimes referred to as ecosystem services. So from pollination services to soil health and water regulation and water quantity and quality, nutritious food for healthy livestock, which creates healthy food, natural aesthetics and beauty, air quality. There's a whole raft of benefits that these habitats are providing. So just to go into a bit more detail on a few of these. So biodiversity, first of all, species-rich grasslands are one of, if not the most biodiverse habitats that we have in this country. And we are one of the most nature-depleted countries, if not the most nature-depleted country in Europe, certainly, and one of the most nature-depleted in the world. So we are facing a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate crisis, and this makes these habitats critical for conservation and protection because of the number of different species that can be found in them and also rely upon them. So there's over 700 different species of flowers and grass that have been found in British meadows, and it's believed that they support over 1,400 invertebrate species. Again, there's actually been 1,400 have been recorded in meadow environments. They will obviously, some of those will be frequenting other habitats as well, but they are obviously using this habitat too. And that earlier statistic as well of the fact you could have a single meadow could have up to 40 different species per meter squared. So it's both the number of species and also the concentration of species that can be found in these habitats is quite staggering. And the pollination services they provide, a really diverse meadow can have, again, Plant Life I think did a calculation where they estimated between 700 and 800 different flowers. So flowering stems could be found in a single meter squared. So, that's including your buttercups and your ribwort plantain and these sort of less special indicator species, but the amount of kind of nectar and forage opportunities for pollinators within a very condensed area is pretty staggering. it's often easy to see the humming, thriving life that is going on above ground in the summer, but what's going on below ground is as, if not more important, we are increasingly discovering, and it is the ability for diverse swards to create incredibly healthy soils, which makes them incredibly influential in many ways. And the first benefit that brings from the healthy soils is water regulation and retention. So this is linked to soil organic matter levels within the soil, and all of these deep-rooted plants are building up humus and organic matter with functioning relationships with mycorrhizal fungi as well, and down to real depths. So that infographic there is from the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. This is on really deep alluvial floodplain soils. But as you can see there, some of these plants, their rooting depth is going down below 2 meters. So you've got soil organic matter being built up at a real depth. There's a deep area of active soil, and for every percentage of organic matter in the soil, it's estimated that can store up to an additional 1.5 Olympic swimming pools worth of water per hectare. So it's really significant. And when we're seeing increasing climate extremes, where we're going from much wetter winters to much drier summers, this helps to regulate and to ease off, buffer those bumps. So in periods of wet, there's much higher potential for these soils to store water. And then in drier periods, it releases that much slower. So some of these extreme hot, dry summers that we've recently experienced, you drive around and the only green grass fields are the ones that have diverse suite of broadleaf herbs within them. And it keeps soil in place as well. So these are permanent pastures, and it stops the scenario which we unfortunately see all too often with red water running down our roads and then into our rivers, which is pollution. And soil organic matter is carbon based. So the other benefit is that you are sequestering and storing a lot of carbon, again at depth and rapidly. So this infographic here just gives a bit of a comparison of different very broad, this is on a kind of global scale, but this is different habitat types. And what is interesting to see is that temperate grasslands, whilst obviously above ground, they don't have the same capacity as forest habitats, but below ground, they have a huge ability to store carbon. And again, the figures that have been estimated here, put some on the slide. This is by the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So they've run some tests to determine what the capacity is, and have shown that for every 0.1% of additional soil organic matter, that can equate to an extra 9 tons of carbon stored. And that moving from species poor to species rich grassland can result in a soil organic matter increase between 0.1 and 0.6% per year. So you have a maximum potential of, well, you have potential between 9 but up to 54 tons potentially of carbon stored per year. And actually we've been running some tests on some of the arable reversion sites that we have supported, and the gains there are even more significant because they're starting from an even lower base. So we're doing a big push actually this year on this topic. So animal health and the nutritional value of species-rich grasslands, and then by extension how that feeds into human health. It's a good excuse mainly to have lots of events with food themes, which is very nice. And we had just had our forum just a few weeks ago with some delicious grass-fed beef stew. And we had Claire Whittle, who's a regenerative vet, who was speaking there, who was speaking passionately about the role that some of these plants can play in improving animal health. And that's because a lot of these broadleaved herbs, actually they can reduce the need for anthelmintics and wormers and antibiotics because they have natural chemical properties within them that perform those functions. So plants such as bird's foot trefoil and plantain, they contain compounds called condensed tannins, and they are known to be antiparasitic, and they can also decrease worm egg numbers as well. So there is a Welsh word for medicine fields, and if you look at old maps, they would have a lot of the old farmsteads would have had these right next to the farmstead, and these would have been the most species-rich fields on the farm, and sick animals would be brought in and to essentially self-medicate. So they would know which plants have the chemical compounds within them, and more often than not, they would see an improved health within the livestock as a result. Obviously, this is a good thing in terms of reducing vet bills, so in terms of bottom line for farming practices, but also enabling and facilitating a move away from chemical anthelmintics and the hugely negative impact that they can have on invertebrate biodiversity. So dung beetles, all of these critical animals which are essential to a fully functioning, biologically healthy farming system. And then the nutritional density as well of having such a varied diet that feeds into the quality of the produce as well, the meat that's being produced. So these are fantastic habitats because they're not only doing biodiversity and carbon sequestration, but you can still produce food off them as well. So there isn't a binary choice here, an either or. You can be producing high quality food still from these. And animals grazed on biodiverse pastures, their meat has been shown to contain much higher levels of essential vitamins, vitamin E, and also omega-3 fatty acids, so the healthy fatty acids. And finally, they're just beautiful. They're beautiful habitats to be in. So our connection, we are part of nature, and there is increasing evidence that for human health and well-being, we absolutely need to be in nature-rich environments. And Plant Life again conducted a study showing that high blood pressure can be lowered simply by being in a wildflower meadow for as little as a few seconds. And social green prescribing, meadow bathing, all of these realizations are leading to more of a push at looking at how we can have nature as a part of medical practices and trying to improve health and well-being within the wider population. If you weren't converted already, hopefully I've converted you to why species-rich grasslands and meadows are so fantastic, and why it's critical that we try and reverse the declines that we have seen over the last 80 or so years. And I'm going to talk now about the practical elements of making meadows. So Herefordshire Meadows has, since 2019, we have been fortunate enough to acquire funding to be able to support landowners all over the county to bring back these habitats and create new species-rich grasslands. And the first thing I would say is that preparation is key, and starting early is really critical. So the process of making a meadow starts at least a year before the seed actually gets strewn. And this is because we need to think carefully, first of all, about the suitability of the site, how it's being managed now, whether the correct management can be put in place after the intervention, looking at the soils. So typically these habitats need relatively low nutrient soils. So we will do soil testing on all potential sites to check, particularly in mobile nutrients such as phosphates, to check that they are suitably low to support a diverse system. We look at weed burden, which actually is often an indication of over-nutrification. And how it's going to be managed going forward. So that, as I said earlier, that broad approach of cutting in late summer and aftermath grazing, is that already in place? And if not, can that be put in place? Have you got the infrastructure, the fencing, water supply, access to machinery, etc.? So there's quite a lot of planning that is required, but it really pays off dividends in terms of the future success of the establishment. And probably more important than anything else is also the landowner motivation and commitment to manage this in an appropriate way for species-rich grassland for the foreseeable, because this is not a quick process. We define our establishment phase as being the first 10 years, and as I said, some of these meadows are ancient, they're hundreds of years old, so it takes time. So once we've done those assessments, we have determined that the site would be a suitable candidate for proactive introduction of seed. First preparatory step is to try and remove as much vegetation as possible. That can be done in various different methods. So that could just be through a late tight hay cut. Often it could be through grazing. Often it's a combination of both. We have had situations where we've used a flail cut and collector, which can actually also be done so tightly that it can do a bit of scalping and creating bare ground. Before actually we do begin, one of the other things we do is we'll be doing a baseline survey, botanical survey, because we want to quantitatively track that change over time and what the effect of the intervention has had. And obviously we don't want to be inadvertently introducing or making interventions into a site which actually already may contain some of these indicator species that I listed earlier. So once you've got your grass down really short, then the next step is to create some bare ground. And the reason for doing this is that typically what we're dealing with is a grass-dominated system. So very few broadleafed herbs. And we need to break that dominance that the grasses have. And we have experimented with different methodologies. There's a few here which we have used. We've also used stubble rakes, as well as, which is a slightly more aggressive version of a spring tine, very shallow rotavators, and the amount of bare ground. We've also experimented with that. But broadly speaking, we have found that you do need to have a minimum of 50% bare ground, which can look quite impactful, but this is very, very shallow. So this is not cultivating. This is just scuffing the surface. This is just breaking the grass rhizomes, the clumps of grasses, to give space for the seed that you're introducing, so it can make good contact with the soil surface. And having really short grass is really helpful with this, because if you did not have short grass and you went in with a spring tine or a power harrow, you just simply end up just throwing loads of thatch around. And again, that just creates a cover over the soil surface and a barrier for the introduced seed for making good contact. So whilst that's going on at the receptor site, we are busy harvesting seed. So this is our fantastic contractor Matt Cobb, who assists us with our seed harvesting, which is all run. The seed harvesting operations are all run by my colleague Caris, and this is our seed harvester. So this is a Logic brush seed harvester. It's a very simple bit of kit. It is very agile because it's small scale. It allows us to get into smaller fields and to more remote locations, and it also means that we have a very, very light touch and low impact on the lovely donor sites that we're harvesting from. So essentially it's just a box on wheels with a row of nylon brushes inside that box, which spin very, very, very fast and sweep across the surface of the ripe seed flower heads, collecting them into that hopper, which then will be tipped out, dried first of all in the field with a rough sieve, and then it will go on for secondary processing afterwards. We are very fortunate to have access to some fantastic donor sites within the county and neighbouring counties as well. And we offer a payment because we recognise the value of the crop. This is a crop for us. We're harvesting the seed, but we leave the meadows so they can also still have a hay cart as well. So it's a bit of a bonus for the landowners. And if any of you or anyone within the group thinks that they may have a really, really species-rich meadow and you would be interested in finding out more about this, then do get in touch either with myself or with Caris directly. Her contact details are on the website. And we will only ever harvest once in every 3 years as an absolute maximum, because what we absolutely don't want to be doing is having any impact on these existing meadows, but again, because they are so precious as habitats and so rare. So we don't want to be depleting the resources there. And we report to the Animal Plant Health Agency, so we do a lot of due diligence with our seed harvesting. So as I say, we'll have a rough sieve in the field, and then it will most typically go and find itself in a big open barn for a few days, like this photo on the left. And that is because when the seed is harvested, it can be up to 50% water, wet weight within the green seed. And we need to dry it off, spread it out and dry it off, because otherwise, if it's piled up, it will just start to heat up and to rot, and that will make the seed unviable. So I'm talking here about brush seed harvesting. There are other methodologies. Green hay transfer is one that you may have heard of, and we have used that method, but the logistics of it are quite complex, and that is all around this speed at which you need to transfer because of the water content in the green hay and the fact that it will start heating up very, very quickly, particularly on a hot summer's day when you've cut it. And so it needs to be spread and broadcast on the receptor site very quickly. So often we do the instances we've done green hay transfer, that has typically been when there has been a very short distance between the donor site and the receptor site, and often where there is the same management control over both, so that the same landowner can make absolutely sure that the receptor site is ready ahead of the hay being cut and then transferred over and spread across it. The benefit of the brush harvested seed methodology is that once we've dried the seed off, we can then bag it up and store it, and then we have a lot more flexibility in terms of when we actually spread it on the receptor site. The photo on the right here is my colleague Anna, who is working on a seed sieve. So it's very low tech, but this has a much finer grading on it, and what it basically does is it sieves that seed down, which comes with a lot of the longs and the chaff, and it sieves it down to a grade where it can now go through a mechanical broadcaster, which is really a really great additional capability that we now have, because it enables us to consider broadcasting over much larger areas. And this is that broadcaster. So on the right hand side, that is Hayden Brooks from EcoHab Wildflowers seed, and it's a very simple bit of kit. Again, it's just a direct drive linked up to a quad bike, with just a large aperture which allows the still quite coarse seeds to trickle through and then be spread out on a spinner across the receptor site. So on the left there is what we were doing when we first started, so hand broadcasting. which is a fantastic thing to do in terms of engagement, volunteers. We've done it with school groups, we've done it with arts groups. It's a really great way to have that direct connection. But obviously over larger areas, it is time consuming, it's very labour intensive, and it was becoming a bit of a limitation in terms of the scale that we could work at. And then the first winter management is really quite critical. So I've mentioned before that broad principle of the aftermath grazing and the cycle, the annual cycle of meadow management. But particularly in this first winter, we want to make sure that we are grazing at the right times to the right level to give the best possible chance of those newly introduced seeds germinating and getting established. In a more established situation, because a lot of these plants are perennials, with the exceptions of things like yellow rattle, they can tolerate periods of slightly interrupted management and bounce back. Again, they are incredibly resilient. But when we're trying to move from a very depleted, species poor system into a species rich system, we at those initial establishment years, we really want to give them the best possible chance. So we run a winter management training day for all of the landowners that we support every winter, and these are the broad message that we give is to take that seedling's eye view. So if you think that you're a little seedling there, what do you need? You need light, air and water to germinate. And what's going to prevent you from getting that is the grass regrowth, swamping out those seedlings. So bringing in that aftermath grazing, be it sheep, cattle, whatever that it may be, to keep that sward as low as possible, with the caveat that we are seeing increasingly wet winters, so we need to take additional care and caution with that we're not creating any soil damage by having too many livestock on for too long. Again, because particularly in this first winter, the soil surface is a bit more vulnerable because it's had that scarifying. That is always the balance, the juggling act. But yes, keeping that a sward nice and open, and then obviously when the yellow rattle appears, definitely removing those livestock. So in summary, the four key takeaways I would give are that preparation is key, as I say. So if you need to wait a year to control your weeds or do more cut and collecting to reduce fertility or find the right seed source, then it would certainly encourage you to do so. Definitely creating enough bare grounds, as I say, minimum 50%. That is key for establishment success. Broadcasting on the surface, so we are mimicking what would be happening in a hay cut here, where if you think the seed is, when the hay is cut, the seed just drops down onto the surface. When the hay is tedded and turns, that is just agitating it, dropping onto the surface. They're not being buried. It's not a cultivated system like your cornfield annuals might need. So it's surface broadcasting, and then that first winter management, which I've just mentioned. This is our map to date. So we are just on the cusp of passing 1,000 acres of meadow creation all across the county, and we still have blank spots we definitely want to try and fill in. We don't want any white spaces. We want dots all over the place. So we've been fortunate. This is through funded projects. There is more going on privately funded, and we offer consultancy advice to landowners who are doing restoration independently themselves, but simply through funded project work, we have almost breached the 1,000-acre threshold since 2019. And then something more recently that has been a really great additional asset to our delivery and our team, and a really great success, has been the establishment of a new volunteer program. So these are our Meadow Monitors. Fantastic bunch of volunteers who have been recruited in to help us to revisit and resurvey some of the sites that we have supported, restoration sites we've supported in previous years. And this is often an element of meadow management and meadow creation which is overlooked, or and normally it's a resource issue. So it's funders are very happy to provide funding for capital interventions. It's much harder to find funding for ongoing support. But as I mentioned earlier, this is an ongoing process. Meadow establishment, it takes its time. It's a slow process. It's in constant evolution, and being able to revisit with this fantastic team supporting us has been been invaluable. So we visited last summer all of the sites that we supported in 2021, and this year we aim to go back to all the sites that we supported in 2022 and 2023. So this is to give us a representative picture of how they're doing 3 to 4 years post establishment. And the initial results that we've had from the 2021 meadows are really, really positive to see. So we have got upward trends across all the sites. So the lines here are showing the average number and the abundance. So abundance and presence. So the average number of desirable species just present in the site, and then the average number of those in each metre squared. And the presence of indicator species over the 4 years increased by 128% on average, and the abundance across all the sites on average increased by 200%. So it's fantastic quantitative data to have to show that meadow creation, the reintroduction of these species that would struggle to otherwise recolonize, works, and we can use that going forward to hopefully stimulate support for more of this habitat creation work. And in fact, actually 8 of those field parcels that we resurveyed had done so well that they went on to be submitted to that priority habitat database that I mentioned earlier. I thought it would be good to talk about how yourselves as a group, as a community, how all of us can play a part in supporting these habitats. 4 ways here. There will be many more, but doing creation, restoration yourself, knowledge sharing, surveying, monitoring, and advocacy. I'm just going to briefly talk about each of these and some ideas and suggestions. So meadow creation and restoration, we've been talking up until now at a field scale, a kind of agricultural scale, but I recognise that not everyone has access or ownership to large areas of land. So I just wanted to do a really big shout out to mini meadows and roadside verges and diversity in grassland habitats at all scales. So I've actually just come from we were giving a talk to Cradley Wild, so it's going wild from east to west of the county, the full spectrum, and that was all focused about how we can create more botanical diversity within gardens, and it can be as small as a plant pot, that you can be introducing some more biodiversity. And actually the power of these small spaces is that they create stepping stones through the landscape. So for pollinators that can't travel long distances and are really struggling because of fragmented populations, and that's leading to genetic inbreeding and genetic stagnation, these small areas play a critical role in connecting the larger habitat areas of habitat with each other. So some of you may very well be aware of Plant Life's Nomo May project, which has now been going for several years and has gained more and more traction. They've extended it to call it Let It Bloom June as well, to simulate that whole sort of hay meadow window period. But If nothing else, it's an excuse to do less garden chores. So what's not to like about it? And obviously, you can't bring a tractor into your back garden to do your ground scarifying to create your mini meadow, but there's plenty of other ways to do it at a small scale. So scarifying with a brush cutter. This is a power rake that I'm struggling to push up a hill, which we couldn't get any larger machinery into, or just even a hand rake on a small area. And the principles are the same. So creating that bare ground when you're introducing the seed, and then you'll be just simulating the grazing with cutting instead, making sure you're lifting the cuttings. So a few cuts during the winter periods, certainly one by late February, just before the germination happens, and then leaving it and then doing a cut and simulated hay cuts later in the summer. And then knowledge sharing. I think this is really the power of groups like Wye Valley Wilders. It's a community, it's a network, and there is huge strength and empowerment within that. So knowledge sharing, whether that is in terms of the events that you hold, and we're delighted that we're going to be doing some follow-up events out in the field with your group later in the summer. Or just knowledge sharing in terms of local knowledge with regards to graziers or contractors, hay cutting contractors, fencing contractors, who's in your local area, where is their seed locally. All of this is a fantastic resource to be tapped into, and I know that I believe that Louise is working on that kind of cluster idea and trying to really kind of boost that knowledge sharing capacity that is there. And there's lots of ways you can get involved as well with surveying and monitoring. So we have it's all open access on our website, on our surveying monitoring page. We have our survey sheets, which you're very welcome to access, download, use to do monitoring of your meadows. And there's a great video on YouTube done by Stuart Headley, the County Botanical Recorder, showing the methodology. But there's also national campaigns. So here, this is the big butterfly count, the bee walks that Bumblebee Conservation Trust do, Plant Life do every flower count, soil sampling. So, and it all feeds into kind of citizen science data, and it really helps to give a more clear picture of what the kind of the situation is on the ground. And finally, advocacy. So we work hard to advocate through the Grassland Action Group and through Plant Life, and we have been down to Westminster as well. So we are advocating for better recognition of species-rich grasslands. They're often the poor sort of cousin to arable systems, particularly in agri-environment schemes. And it helps us to build a stronger case if we get case studies again from the ground. So we've, for those who are involved with agri-environment schemes, obviously we have had very disappointing news that GRH6, so species-rich grassland, has been removed from SFI, and it's now going to be in higher tier. And if that has impacted you directly in whatever way, we would love to hear from you, because it gives us a really strong case to be made. And then there's lots of other things you can be doing. So shout about grasslands to your local MP, support the Plant Life Grassland Gap campaign, protect existing grasslands, so we can come and carry out surveys and register things with Natural England on the priority habitat if you think there is a really high value habitat that has gone under the radar. Supporting charities that are advocating for these habitats, and finally supporting local farms who are championing this. So Pasture for Life is an organisation that some of you may have heard of, which is championing grass-fed systems. And we've got a fantastic network of farmers who really understand the value and importance of diverse grassland systems, and it's payback for you as well. So as I said earlier, if you're buying meat from animals that are grazing on diverse grasslands, then it's a higher, it's going to support your own personal health as well, and that local economy. But yeah, there's our contact details. So that's our website. We're also on social media. If you want to follow us on Facebook or Instagram, my email's there, and our general email if you do want to get in touch. I can share these slides. So if you want to set up, we've got some more resources on there as well. But that brings me to a close. If there's any questions.
If you've already got a meadow that really, has good diversity, what's the best way to try and improve it still further? I mean, obviously so many things one could tweak. Is there any kind of simple statement you can make on that, or is that just too dense a question, really?
I would say it probably in a nutshell, kind of consistency of management is key. So if you already are lucky enough to have some species-rich grasslands, then ensuring that you are following that meadow management cycle that I kind of covered. So ensuring that you are cutting it every summer in July period, and that you are grazing it sufficiently to graze off the regrowth as well. So that will keeps the system dynamic, keeps the sward open, keeps that natural cycling as well. Of the kind of seed bank that's already in there. I would say that would be the main thing. And there is always, I think the beauty of the system is it is dynamic. So there will always be fluctuations year on year, even if it's simply because weather conditions change each summer. So the hay cut will happen at different times. That will favour different species. But it's the diversity means that actually that is to its benefit by having that dynamism year on, year out. But yeah, if there's specific things that you kind of think are of a concern, or you kind of want to have sort of more advice on, then yeah, I'd be happy to kind of speak about that in more detail separately for your specific site.
No, thank you. That's incredibly helpful, actually. And I've started to pick this up, that consistency, not to change it, because the local species will have adapted to what you're doing. I guess obviously you hear, and we're trying to learn from Louise and the group and your group at Herefordshire Meadows and everything. You on the one hand, sometimes some advice is to perhaps change things, try different things, and but I am picking this up elsewhere, that consistency, that's a really, really helpful thing. Thank you.
I just had a question, Rory, linked to that one. If you already had a meadow there, like your meadow, I know it's a beautiful species-rich meadow. Would you ever, if there were certain species, UK species, native species that weren't present in the meadow, and you probably didn't have historical data on whether they had ever been present, would you ever advise introducing plug plants of particular species, particularly rare species, maybe things like betony or things that aren't picked up by the the seed harvesters, anything like that? Or would you leave it alone as it is?
So that is a fantastically topical question, Louise. It's almost as if I prepped you, but I didn't, I promise. But we're delighted that we have just been successfully offered the opportunity to do a Big Give fundraising campaign in April as part of their Earthrise fundraising campaign. And this year, our focus is going to be exactly on that. It's going to be on supporting the reintroduction of specifically 3 species, so betony, common milkwort, and devil's bit scabious, which were put onto the UK red plant data list last year, which is just shocking, really. So the red list is that they are at threat of extinction. And to be in that situation with these plants that were very common in Herefordshire until not very recently, until quite recently, is quite shocking. And as you say, Louise, one of the reasons is that we do struggle to pick them up with our brush seed harvester. So they are either very low growing, or the timing of that they flower means that we just don't get in there. So absolutely, for those specific species, we feel we should give them a helping hand. And the initial aim is to identify 10 sites which will be assessed and specifically selected for suitability for hosting these plants, because there are also some kind of nuances around grazing times and soil types as well. But yeah, a lot of the reasons why these plants are not naturally being transposed is because they really struggle to move of their own accord. And again, other things like Tormentil is very low growing. It's something that Stuart Headley, I think, would love us to try and support the propagation of. In terms of suitability of species, we will always defer to Stuart Headley. So County Botanical Recorder, for people who don't know him already, a fountain of all knowledge, and he guides us expertly on what is suitable for Herefordshire's grasslands, so that we are sure that we're not inadvertently introducing species that may well be native but not necessarily distinctive of grasslands within our county.
Thank you. Well, I just want to first of all say what a first-class talk. I have to say, really cheered up by such a good talk. My question follows on really quite smoothly from the previous discussion. Obviously, it's magnificent to have 937 acres of new meadows and to be following up how well they are establishing themselves. My question is really about other kinds of recovery, and I'm being selfish because I'm talking about what we're trying to do, obviously, which is where we're not introducing anything in terms of new plant species. We're just managing the land fairly rigorously in order to pretty single-mindedly, I would say, probably, to recover diversity. And that's a process that's been going on for I think we've now done 8 seasons. And my question is partly referencing the previous point about whether introducing species is a good idea and when to do that in terms of how long it takes to discover what you've got left. That was my initial objective, was to find out what there was left on the farm when we bought it, because I was really very interested to know what was being suppressed by the management, rather than somehow having a grand plan to make it much nicer. I just was really interested to know what would come out of hiding, as it were, when there wasn't grazing all the time with lots of sheep. But the other thing is, if you are going to have that kind of recovery, how do you monitor the effectiveness of the Herefordshire Meadows initiative, sort of in the breeze, as it were, with people like me who were not sowing anything? And I mean, and presumably there is some potential for land which has been suppressed for years by management, which hasn't been poisoned with artificial fertilizer, or sort of isn't irretrievable, hasn't lost its fungi burden or whatever. And what do you do about that? Because in a way, the genetics there is much more pure, because it's not had anything added to it since the 19th century, probably.
Yes. So I've very much focused on the creation, as you point out, Tom. That was sort of the brief for the talk.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I fully agree, and I think what you are doing is fantastic to see the results of that management, and a whole other string of the work we do is surveying and monitoring and offering advisory work to existing old grasslands, where it may be the case, as you say, that the species are there, they just need the opportunity to be allowed to thrive. So we have been supporting, giving bespoke support to the other end of the spectrum, some triple SIs that have been struggling, some local wildlife sites that have been struggling, and it has been a case of needing a change of management. So absolutely, I think there is an argument to be said, and the reason, another reason, as I mentioned earlier, for doing that surveying before we do anything is to check, make sure what we absolutely don't want to be doing is what is quite a one-off, quite an intrusive process to try and break the existing system and move it to a more biodiverse one. And we absolutely don't want to be doing that if there are already existing nice species on the site. And I think in terms of assessing that, the impact of a change, I would say that monitoring should happen if any change takes place. So whether that is introducing seed proactively or simply just changing management, I think it's critical and also fascinating to see what the impact of that can be. And even if it's already in a hay meadow management system and it's all doing fantastically well like that, it even just moving that hay cutting timing slightly can have quite an impact in terms of the population proportional breakdown between different species. And having a quantitative record of that can be really instructive to see what the cause and effect may or may not have been. So I would strongly encourage continued monitoring. And as you say, I think particularly if you're new to a site, take that time, go through a whole season, give it a chance to just express itself. And that's all part of that planning and preparation. And sometimes, as you say, you can be pleasantly surprised, but of what might be there already, and just needed that opportunity to thrive. Yeah.
I mean, but just to follow up on that, with in our experience, the time it's taken for species to emerge, or already being there recolonized, or for individual fields to acquire a character of their own, because when we arrived, the fields looked different in terms of their topography, but they all were very similar in terms of their apparent vegetation, has been very various. I mean, some things appeared immediately, some things have taken 8 years to appear, some things haven't appeared, some things haven't moved. I mean, going back to the really terrible point you were making, very good but terrible news about Bethany, Devil's Bits, Gables and Milkwort. I mean, having said that we're interested in seeing what's already there, I have to say that looking at our existing land holding, the Bethany and the Devil's Bits Gables weren't colonizing from anywhere. They were tiny amounts and they weren't moving at all. And the only way we've increased the amount of those two species is to buy more land that has them on it. So, I mean, I can see there is a very good case for introducing things when, as you say, when you've had time to find out really literally how the land lies. And that is quite a slow process. I mean, going back to something you said earlier about the seasons, we had a dreary year in 2024 because the previous year had reversed the reduction in grass content in the fields enormously because of how wet it had been. I mean, it was really striking how a lot of the gains were reversed because of one really wet spring. I mean, it was really striking that, and obviously we weren't going to be downhearted by 1 year, obviously, but it was quite striking how if you've just done a survey in 2024, you just thought, what the hell's been going on for the last 7 years?
I think it demonstrates again, doesn't it? Diversity is key. Diversity is resilience, so that your system can weather these increasingly extreme variations in weather that we're seeing from year to year. And yes, some things do take a long time, some things are quicker, and they can give you an indication of the potential much sooner. So yeah, there's lots of things to be considering when you're looking, kind of making an assessment, a sort of triage, I guess, is of where you're at with your grasslands. But we can help with that. So if anyone is interested, we can offer that support. Yeah.
Thanks for a really great talk. We're actually over the border in Gloucestershire in the Forest of Dean.
Okay.
I represent Friends of Worcester Walk. It's an old enclosure from Charles I's attempts to kind of stop people ravaging the forest, where he appointed wardens. So we have 3 old fields. But my question is about field ants. One of the problems we have when scything, because we do scything now, end of July, start of August, one of the real pains is mounds from field ants. But I guess that's a good sign that we've actually got a very old meadow. And although it's been allowed to be grazed constantly and turned by horses and whatever and rented out, we're trying to kind of revert it back to more of a wildflower meadow. But presumably that's a good sign, is it, that you've got these mounds of field ants?
In a way, the fact that you are able to sieve it by hand means that you can have that fantastic kind of micro topography within the field alongside species-rich grasslands. It would obviously be it would be a big challenge if a non-starter for a kind of traditional hay cut taking place in the field parcel. But as you say, they are an indication of a healthy functioning biological system. So clearly you have got healthy soils, healthy ecosystem there to support those. And you would more typically see them in an extensive species-rich permanent pasture. So where it's not being cut, but it's being managed appropriately through grazing to still support diversity within the grassland. And then you have the anthills as well, which in themselves can be fascinating little microhabitats because of, you just have that constant bare ground creation at small level and different heats, and you've got the full kind of north, south, east, west aspect on it as well. So they're no bad thing to have, and if you're able to simultaneously still be cutting some grass around it, then great, or using grazing in an appropriate way to still continue the diversity of the species in those fields.
Yeah, right. We do aftermath grazing with sheep now, Herdwick sheep. So, and we can kind of scythe round the mounds or striking them occasionally, but they seem to plod on quite happily.
Yeah, thanks again. Everybody's been really impressed with the talk. I agree with everybody. So thank you very much for that. Just your point about increasing micro topography and the fact that sort of modern ways of maintaining meadows very much involves coming in and sort of mowing and knocking lots of the micro topography flat, and actually, in many ways adding to the sort of problems of sort of compaction of soils and so on. There was just a few points that I thought were quite interesting from the last talk we had to do with invertebrates, about the fact that if every now and then when you're actually mowing, you actually leave a strip for allowing sort of outgrowth, and a lot of the invertebrates can actually hide in that sort of protected strip, and that potentially could be the same strip each year, or it could actually be moved. And the other thing was that we had a talk regarding trip to Romania last year, and the fact that the field margins, or the very small patches of fields, the margins were actually large mounds of anthills, and they actually ended up sort of being the sort of boundary between people's field boundaries, but it was an area where the sort of the ants could thrive, and there could be this sort of mosaic in a sort of somewhat formal, straight way between the sort of meadowland and where sort of anthills are allowed to thrive. So I was just wondering whether one could do a sort of a strip where you're enabling ants to thrive, and strips where you enable invertebrates to overwinter and be more sort of abundant in the sort of following year, and whether that could be introduced into a management plan that would improve that.
Yeah, well, I think the word mosaics is key. These species-rich meadows shouldn't exist in a vacuum. The greatest benefit you can do for nature, if you're thinking if your ultimate aim is to create as biodiverse a system as possible, then mosaics are key. And meadows sit within a wider system of wide hedgerows, margins along those hedgerows. Yes, we worked on a project with Buglife where it was a stipulation that they would have leave strips uncut, but they would move those through the meadow, because if you leave the same strip all the time, it will turn over time more rank, and then you might turn into scrub, and which is another habitat in itself. But it's, you know, trying to balance that in within the open habitats that was the primary aim of being supported and created in that project. So yes, I agree. I think invertebrate refuges are something to be supported and championed if that can be done, if that is possible. Leaving wider margins as well. And you know, this kit has got bigger as you know, farming has got more intensive and industrialized. Obviously, until not that long ago, these meadows would have all been cut by scythes, by hand, and that's no longer the case. And that does have an impact, as you say, in terms of diesel use and compaction and the rapidity of the mowing process. But I think that in the whole scheme of things, it is still a very extensive system. It is a very low impact system, a single cut occurring in it. You are doing much greater benefits by having that diversity in terms of soil health, by maintaining that biodiverse system and all of that below ground rooting activity which I showed. And to some degree, it's often a case of just practicalities. So if you are able, you know, if you have all the kit yourself, you have full management control, you have the time, you have all of these kind of resources available, then you can, you can modify down to the nth degree. You could create an amazing kind of like bespoke management plan. But if you are reliant on a contractor to do the hay cut or a grazier to do the grazing, I think the most important thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that consistency, and having a hay cut happening and the grazing happening is that would be the most critical thing, I would say, to maintain, to both establish and maintain these habitats. So sometimes that does involve some compromises.
Could I just briefly add to that? I mean, we have no control over when the hay cut happens, except within the annual agreement, which specifies a minimum early date because of the mid-tier rules. And as a result of that, I developed a system of having strips which moved in all the fields, most of the fields, in order to accommodate the fact that I didn't want all of them cut at the same time, but they had to be. And that has worked very, very well in terms of every year mowing a different bit, but always leaving a bit in the middles of the fields, the sunny, nicest bits, as opposed to the margins, which are also important, as has been said, you know, for other reasons. And that diversity of sites across all the fields has really made an enormous difference, because every year each field is ready at different times, different things are seeding at different times, and without having any kit or any control of the people doing the work, doing it spatially has worked, if that makes sense. And just on the other thing, on the anthill point, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, we've got bits we can't cut because of anthills, and it's, you know, I'm very glad we do, because different things live in them.
Rory, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed that, and a really fascinating, huge wealth of knowledge that you have there. Really impressive. Great to get an expert to answer questions and tell us more about meadows. Thank you so much. Okay.
Hey, you're very welcome. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you out in a meadow in the summer.
Definitely.